Are we heading for an economic crash, one caused by the AI, artificial intelligence bubble? Well, there's no better person to speak to because the vast majority of economists, I'm afraid to say, did not see the 2008 financial crash coming. It was a massive shock to the vast majority of the profession as well as politicians. There was an exception, though, and the exception is joining me today as Dr. Steve Keen, who is an incredible economist, but also honorary professor at UCL and amongst his other hats, lots of other hats. Great to see you, Professor Steve Keen, I should say. How you doing?
Good to be back again. We've spoken once before, Owen, almost a decade ago, so it's good to be back in touch again.
Oof. Blimey.
We did. Yeah.
A lot has happened. I know I remember,
Yeah,
but
like lots of grey
been...
hair for me. Yeah.
I just want to let's start because we'll talk about AI and a possible looming crash. But you, as I've said, you predicted the 2008 financial crash. Why did you see that coming? And what was it you saw in advance that other people did not see?
Well, the fundamental thing I saw is the role of credit in causing both booms and busts in capitalism. And the reason the mainstream doesn't see this is that they have a model of banking, which is a myth. It's called loanable funds. And what they pretend is that banks don't actually lend money. Instead, what banks do is they act like intermediaries. You probably know this joke. Most people don't get it. But I call the conventional model of banking the Ashley Madison theory of banking. You get the reference?
I don't. Hit me with it.
Oh, Ashley Madison, I don't know if it still exists, but it was a website that let married people fuck other married people that they weren't actually married to, okay? And so Ashley Madison didn't actually fuck you, but they introduced somebody else who would fuck you, and they charged a fee, okay? Now, that's fundamentally the model of banking that neoclassicals have, that banks don't actually lend money, but they enable a person who saves money to lend to somebody else who borrows money. And what that means is if the saver lends money, they've got less spending power, but the borrower has more. And if the borrower pays the debt back, the borrower's got less spending power, but the saver's got more. So basically it cancels out and you can ignore credit. That is complete bullshit. Pardon me being technical here, but that's what they've stuck with as a theory of banking right from when the theory first formed 150 years ago. Neoclassical economics began in the 1870s. And the reason is they don't want to include money in the system because they have a sort of barter model of capitalism. And if you bring in that money is actually creation of money actually adds to demand, then that disturbs their entire intellectual apple cart. And it's a bit like trying to get Catholics to believe that Mary wasn't a virgin. It's just too big a step for them. So they ignore the real world. They ignore critics like me who've been saying this case for virtually actually more than a century. The first person to make it in the academic literature was Joseph Schumpeter, and I'll be talking about him in relation to the AI bubble. But Schumpeter, Irving Fisher, Hyman Minsky, a whole range of non-orthodox economists are saying banks lend money, fact one, and when they lend money, that adds to aggregate demand and income. And I've proven that analytically, and that's what I was looking at. So the conventional economists completely ignore private debt, and they ignore the change in private debt, and the change in private debt is credit. And that's what I can prove logically, but also show empirically, adds to aggregate demand and income. So when credit is positive, you get a boom. If credit goes negative, you get a serious downturn. And that's what happened in 2007. The mainstream had no idea what was happening because they ignored the data, even though their institutions collect it.
So you've got slides here, haven't you, to prove this?
Yeah.
We love slides.
Yeah.
Should we work on some slides?
Yeah, bring up
I'm
that.
excited.
There we go. So this is my Ravel software, which is it's now a commercial program for analyzing data as well as analyzing economics. And this is the level of private debt and government debt in America. Pardon, it's moving too quickly there. I'll scroll a different way. But you can see the number that all the mainstream economists focus on is government debt. And you can see government debt began at about 100% of GDP after World War II and then trended down most of the time until the global financial crisis when it rose. But the reason it rose was the global financial crisis, because when you look at the change in private debt, that's what I call credit, and that's graphed down here, the increase in credit reached the level of credit, which is newly borrowed money that people borrow to spend. Nobody borrows for the sheer pleasure of being in debt. So you borrow the money, you borrow it to spend, and that added 15% of demand over and above GDP at the peak of the subprime bubble in 2006, 2007, and then it fell to -5%. And that's the first time since World War II that credit went negative. So that was what caused the boom beforehand and the crash of the global financial crisis. And when you look at the correlation this has with credit with unemployment, which of course is a product of the level of economic activity, it's absolutely ludicrous. So I'm showing the data for the whole post-war period there. But if I zoom in and take a look at what happened from a period that neoclassical economists call the Great Moderation, when they were patting themselves in the back for the fall in economic volatility and so on, if I then calculate that and show the correlation coefficient, I'm just going to zoom out so I can show the correlation here. That's over here. Okay. The correlation between 1990 and 2015 of credit with unemployment was minus 0.92. Now, that's pretty much saying one is a mirror image of the other. If credit's going up, unemployment falls. If credit's going down, unemployment rises. I saw the level of private debt in 2005 and thought this ratio of private debt to GDP simply cannot continue rising. When it changes direction, it'll be the biggest fall in credit since the Great Depression, because the level of private debt has never been higher than it was in 2007, and that's going to cause a downturn. That's why I warned about it. Neoclassicals completely ignored it. Bang, it happened. And then, of course, I became public enemy number one to that mob.
Well, I mean, what do you mean by that, public enemy number one? What kind of response?
Yeah, before the crisis, people like me, I mean, economics always generates heretics because the actual belief system that neoclassical economists have is a complete fantasy, but it's a very seductive fantasy. It describes capitalism as the best possible social system. But at some point, people will, a minority will say, this is just crazy. And they'll flip over to another approach. A lot of them flip over to being Austrians, which is in some ways even weirder than neoclassical. Some flip over to being Marxists, but quite a number flip over to being post-Keynesians, which is my school of thought, basically, as I say, we're driven by realism. So there's always a few of us, and even economic departments like Harvard have somebody who's a critic of the mainstream. And what happens normally is the mainstream, very confident, walk around, and they're all think alike, and they see this person who's a critic and say, "Oh, we'll give them a couple of classes in." They can be a tutor in microeconomics and stuff like that. Pretty much ignore you and laugh about you over coffee. Then when it came along and the crisis was actually spotted by people like me and not by them, we became, oh, that bastard down there is embarrassing and it's in public. Let's sack him. And so rather than economics growing because people like me pointed out the crisis and warned of it, I'd say, oh, thanks very much. Say, you asshole, you're embarrassing us in public. We're going to get rid of you.
I was going to say, because it reminds me, I mean, it's a very different topic, obviously, altogether, but since Israel's genocide in Gaza, I often said they will never forgive us. They will never forgive us for being right about Gaza.
Exactly. The same sort of thing. Yeah.
In terms of AI then, so, a lot of people go, look, we've heard this all before. A new technology comes around, you get the Luddites. Yes, there's change. Jobs are destroyed, but also jobs are created in their place. Personal computing, when that arose, that and the internet, that destroyed jobs, but it also created different jobs. That's just the way of the world. The personal computer didn't cause an economic crash. The internet didn't cause, you did get the dot-com bubble, to be fair. So but I mean, what do you say to that? This is scaremongering that always happens when you get a technological revolution.
Well, partly it's because the mainstream neoclassical economists can't really explain technological change. They have their theories about it, which are very, very hard for them to validate because everything's about equilibrium for them. And what you've got when you have a technological change like the telecommunications in the 1990s or the internet in the 80s or that sort of thing, that disturbs the equilibrium. And the person who spoke best about how technological change disturbs an equilibrium was Schumpeter. And Joseph Schumpeter, one of the most brilliant books in economics, in my opinion, called The Theory of Economic Development. Very, very short book. But he argued that in equilibrium, which is the neoclassical fantasy, there is no economic profit. You can get an accounting profit, as they call it, but you don't get a profit over and above what everybody else is earning. So he said, if you're going to make an over the top profit, a true economic profit, you've got to disturb this equilibrium. And you disturb it by finding some way to produce something more cheaply than anybody else has done before, or you bring along some new product which nobody else has produced before, and those are the basic ideas. So looking at, say, for example, the spinning jenny and the Industrial Revolution in Scotland back in the 1700s, a manual spinning jenny had one worker spinning one wheel to produce yarn. The spinning jenny initially had one worker using a machine that spun 6 wheels, and so you had 6 times the output from one person. And Schumpeter said, if the cost of the machine is less than 5 workers, then it's profitable for the person to bring it in. And then if they built the machine, they've got to borrow money to do it. So borrowing the money actually increases demand. And that's where my argument with Schumpeter and I are completely aligned on banks creating money. But that adds to demand. So that causes a boom when you're first bringing in the new technology. But when the technology comes online, that then undercuts existing cost structures and causes a slump, because a whole lot of old firms suddenly get beaten by the new firm that has the new technology. We can see this in AI, and you see it in the telecommunications bubble beforehand and so on. And the fascinating point that Schumpeter makes is the technology only permeates the whole of society, the whole of the economy during a slump, because first of all, you're bringing it in and you've got to borrow money to be able to, or raise money to be the innovator. You take you compete workers and machinery away from existing businesses, so you cause a boom, and everybody benefits in the boom. Even sushi shops benefited from the telecommunications bubble in the 1990s. But then when the product comes out, it starts to undercut existing businesses and causes a slump. And then in the slump, that's when the technology permeates. So back in the 1990s, for example, we had all this laying of optical fiber in the States, massive amounts of optical fiber laid for the telecommunications internet backbones. But so much that there's so much more was laid than it was actually necessary, that about 90% of it, I think from memory, was called dark fiber. The reason being that to make optical fiber work, you've got to have lasers as well as the cable. And so much of it wasn't worth adding the lasers. So it sat there dormant. But then in 2000, as well as the subprime bubble occurring then, which over sort of counteracted the slump when the telecommunications bubble burst. During that period, that's when it became really cheap to use this dark fiber to suddenly increase the amount of data you could transfer. So it all permeated during the slump. And I think there's definitely that classical side to the AI bubble. Everybody and their dog is producing AI around the world. That investment's causing a huge amount of monetary demand. That's boosting the economy right now. When the AI finally settles down and whatever usage of it becomes a standard part of basic commerce, 90% of the firms that produced it are going to go bankrupt. It will also undercut so many things which used to be expensive. So, you can do diagnosis, for example, medical diagnosis. I reckon AIs will do a better job of that than 95% of doctors. So it'll take business away from doctors. The internet searches and things like that will take money away from other services. So that's going to cause a standard downturn, and that's conventional. So I do expect a recession from the AI once it's fully integrated into the economy and undercuts so many other. And for example, graphic designers are going to lose their jobs and things like that. Okay? So that's the boom and bust cycle. And as you say, that often means that new industries arise and that makes up for the slump. The big difference about AI is that it's quite feasible that robotics could eliminate so many working class jobs, unskilled working class jobs in assembly and manufacturing and so on. And it can also eliminate so many jobs in clerical positions, because so much clerical work can also be done by the AIs. Now, that's not just a cyclical, that's systemic, because the working class has only benefited from the growth in capitalism over time by the fact that labor was necessary to various parts of the manufacturing process. Take that away, and the number of people that are needed for employment could fall by 50%. or more. And then that means suddenly there's a phase change in capitalism. And unless you find another way to give those people income, we're going to end up in the Hunger Games. So I think it really is an epochal change.
But because that's the other thing, I'll just ask you to expand on that, because that's obviously a slightly dystopian proposition for people to have to chew over. I mean, just in terms of a potential looming crash, what are the kind of like mechanics of that in terms of how you could see that unfolding? What kind of length of time? You know, because at the moment people have already seen turbulence, for example, on the stock markets. We've seen
Yeah.
people, various, I guess public figures talk about in a way that you didn't before the financial crisis. There's been some talk about a possible crisis, so it's kind of out there. There is some chat of some
Yeah.
description. What would be the mechanics? Kind of, how would it unfold? What kind of time period? Could we see some sort of downturn, a recession, and how serious could it be?
I think the downturn, like this Schumpeterian downturn stage, I expect in the next year or two, because there's been such a level of overinvestment in AI. I mean, you even get to the stage where Microsoft, I think, was talking about restarting 3 Mile Island. The energy demands of these are just incredible because they're basically doing mathematics, extremely intense, large-scale mathematical operations using computers. So an enormous amount of energy is necessary for that. And the thing is, ultimately, we're likely to find that, like a Chinese kind of firms may well come up with far cheaper AI that it makes you various shortcuts and be executed on your PC rather than using a data center to actually drive it. So the cost system will be driven down dramatically, and that will eliminate so many of the large players that put in, and enough money to buy a nuclear power station to run their data centers. If that ends up being unprofitable, then bang, that company is out of the game. All the people who are working for it lose their jobs, and that's one side. But on the other, if you have AI replacing clerical activities, we already know that you can't talk to a human anymore. When you call up a phone company, you talk to a bot. First of all, that's going to become actually functional. At the moment, it's bloody annoying. At some point, it'll become functional, and then those jobs will disappear. And I'm getting plenty of feedback from people responding to my stuff on YouTube saying they're starting to see it already. Hiring is declining. So I think you're going to see not just a cyclical trend for unemployment to rise, but a secular trend for it to rise. And that's going to take about maybe the next 3 to 5 years. Robotics is the really big one, because once it certainly hasn't happened yet. There was a joke a couple of days ago about Tesla's Optimus falling over during a demo of it handing out water bottles. There is a lot of further, development to go. But once it gets to the stage that a robot can replace an unskilled worker on a production line, then that whole source of employment disappears, and that would mean that if you can't get a job and you have American-style unemployment benefits, you're going to starve to death. So the choice is, how do we provide for these people? And the only way to do it is for the government to provide a universal basic income. And even I've been contacted by some of the Silicon Valley tech gods about this, and they're saying, "Do you think this is likely?" So they're thinking about it. Even people who are rapacious, multi-billionaires at the top of this capitalist system, they're worrying that they won't actually be able to see their goods anymore because the mass market will disappear. So it is a serious issue for the nature of capitalism, and it's a point in which workers will no longer be necessary for firms to produce output. But of course, you need workers to be buying on the other side for firms to make a profit out of the goods they can produce. So it's a really significant stage in capitalism, and I don't have a great deal of faith that we're going to avoid an outcome in which the vast majority of people are living hand to mouth, and that's not what capitalism was supposed to achieve.
I mean, just finally, then I've got a short term and a long term question. The short term is, we've already got various economic issues going on, for example, with the tariffs,
Yep.
trade war that Donald Trump started. So I'm just wondering how you think that interacts with this, and just in terms of the general kind of, other economic factors which are causing turmoil. But the longer one is about that society you're talking about, because I mean, you don't necessarily have to go into the politics of it, but I would observe that the rise of various far right movements have arisen already because of partly because of economic insecurity, because of the squeeze in wages, in living standards, the disintegration of the public realm after the financial crash, because of the response, obviously, of how a crisis of the private sector was turned into a crisis of the public sector. And, what kind of, because there has to be, because the danger is, as ever growing insecurity occurs, those sorts of movements will thrive. So, what are the sort of propositions, that alternative movements that would prefer fascism not to be the future of the West and beyond? So it's that short term, the economic kind of, what do you think about the economic, how is this interacting with other economic issues, and the longer, no biggie, about the future society that we need given the dramatic transformation you're talking about?
I think this is one point where we're going to have the old socialism versus capitalism argument coming up again, because if you just have it simply capitalist and you either make your money out of being a capitalist or out of a worker, the working class is going to lose out of this. Because one fundamental element of my own non-orthodox approach to economics is that I focus upon energy as the main input that causes GDP. When you look at the correlation between energy and GDP, change in energy and change in GDP, it's just off the scale. So what it basically says is, what when capitalists aren't exporting workers, capitalists are exporting energy. Okay. Now, if they can, then they need workers to do that at the moment. Now, if capitalists don't need workers anymore to exploit the energy, then the basis of working class incomes disappears. And that then means you cannot support out of wage income more than, say, 1/3 of the population that aren't capitalists. Now, if that happens, that is social chaos, unless the society says we have to make sure that everybody has at least a standard of living that enables them to survive rather than starving. And that means in terms of how you're going to provide that, it has to be the state providing a universal basic income. And now that's a huge shift. I'm not a fan of UBI right now, because, or if you did it right now, all you do is inflate the price level. But if we have this transition where workers are less and less necessary to exploit the energy that we turn into GDP, then you've got to provide an income for them from another source, and that will have to be the government providing a universal basic income. If they don't do it, then we need to get racism or blame the migrants for the situation rather than technological change. You can see plenty of that, of course, globally. So it's either do it well or we end up in a dystopia.
Because, I mean, that's the key point there, because the reason the far right, a big reason for the far right thriving, is that people have been encouraged to see the economic system as a zero-sum game. That because they understand the economic system's broken, but they don't think there's an alternative to the economic system. So they therefore see themselves as being in competition for ever scarcer resources, with politicians telling them that there is only a future of decline, that the pension age will always go up, that social security entitlements will go down, that public services won't be able to cut, universal public services will diminish and be cut away, and all the rest of it. So that's the problem. That's why what you're saying is so important, because if people think there is a zero-sum game, and that then they think to themselves, well, then if only we got rid of this competition,
Yeah.
the demonized migrant, then there would be more to go round, which isn't true, because obviously migrants actually end up paying in money and contributing to the economy. And so that's why this is so important. So I'm just glad you're talking about this, because it is socialism or barbarism, someone might argue.
That's a pretty good summary. That's a pretty good summary.
Honestly, Steve, it's such a pleasure to talk to you. Let's not do this every 10 years. So I think there's a lot, I think, to come in the coming months. And obviously everyone do engage with, look up obviously Steve online, and it's at Prof Steve Keen on social media. You can obviously read his books. Do go check out his books. If you go to stevekeen.com/books, you can look at the various books that he's got. Like, new economics, for example. So you can learn, I guess all of the kind of general look at economics that Steve has massively contributed. He is the man, as I said, who predicted the 2008 financial crash. So you do well to learn from him. Please like and subscribe, share the video, leave your comments, leave your thoughts. But Steve, it's such a pleasure to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Owen.